Welcome to this week's episode where we have Andrew Rhatigan on again, Season 1, Episode 2. He's back and we are talking about, is it worth buying a house in Ireland? Quite a topical and trending conversation. Andrew, welcome back.
Big question, Kenneth. Yeah, delighted to be here again, and always love our chats.
Good. So let's dig deep on the topic of how to buy a house in Ireland. We can see on Google that it's trending and a lot of people are interested. How do we get on the property ladder?
Well, I think we're in a buoyant market, and oftentimes people probably don't realise what's involved. They just assume you get a mortgage or you have cash and then you set about buying a property. But I think the simple terms, if I was to look at it from a step-by-step guide, when you're buying a property, you are either cash or you are a mortgage. Even if you own a house and you have to sell, that then becomes liquid, or you have a mortgage and you're going to be able to move. So we'll keep it simple for this exercise. The second thing to do before you buy is look at areas that you're interested in. Get a sense of what really suits you, suits your budget, what amenities do you want, and really explore your wish list. Because by clarifying what it is you actually want, you're actually going to add some things and remove them. And your idea of a wish list may be different to your other half if you're buying with someone else. So it's important to have that conversation. And then lastly, as part of that first preemptive bit of homework, look at your timeline. Don't expect to buy a house tomorrow if your finances aren't in order, if you don't have a brokerage in mind that you want to approach from a lending point of view. So make sure that you take a measured review of your circumstances and then gauge it from then on. The third thing I would look at would be your mortgage. So I'm always of the opinion that you can't prepare too much for something like that. Get ready early. So get good advice on saving, spending, and what's actually involved. It's not simply a case of don't bet on the horses on a Tuesday and you'll get a mortgage on the Friday. A lender wants to look at a trend of how you save, how you spend money. And if you get someone who's really, really in-depth in terms of their knowledge for the market and financing, they should steer you from start to finish as to what's expected, what's not expected, and also your timelines and what's involved, which I think is key for people to understand. The next part of this is probably your deposit. And from a first-time point of view, it's going to be 10% and usually three times your earnings to be able to purchase. And for second-time buyers and beyond, it's 20% of the purchase price. It's important to really take into account how you do this, how you put it together, and don't simply use 10% as a cutoff. Always trying to maintain good, solid savings and show a lender that you're a reliable candidate that they can rely on, that they can trust when it comes to the latter stages of the process. And the next things which you're supposed to look at after buying a property would be the likes of stamp duty, which is 1% of the purchase price. Oftentimes people don't actually allow for this. They see the cost up front, they see bidding, and almost the superfluous costs are forgotten about, and they don't take into account legal fees, a valuation, a surveyor, and these are all additional costs and services that are required as part of a purchase. But it's important to know up front and almost overestimate and get a nice surprise rather than pretend you don't know or you don't want to tackle it and then not have the money later on. And from a legal point of view, it's kind of what you pay is what you get. There's price points that could be anywhere from €500 and €1,000 up to €5,000 or €6,000. In my opinion, not all solicitors are created equal, like as in any service. And that's not to say anything negative. Some of them could take on a certain workload and they mightn't give you the time and attention you might need. But it's important that you use your network, find someone you can trust that isn't family, in my opinion.
And just on that, if I'm looking at selling a property while trying to purchase a property, how best should I go about doing it?
The first thing you need to do is get your house, in inverted commas, in order. Speak to your solicitor, get a sense of what needs to be done with your own house. If you have to have paperwork ready, if you need an extension that needs to be signed off, if you need engineers' reports, have everything prepared and ready to go. Also, don't be afraid to speak with your solicitor about what it is you hope to achieve. Because if they're not in line with A, your expectations, and B, your timeline, they might be able to bring you back down to earth, or they might be able to liaise with the respective opposite number should you be purchasing a property from someone else.
Good advice, yeah.
And it's never as simple as it seems when there are multiple moving parts, but once you acknowledge it, it's about trying to work towards that common goal of getting your next property.
Great. It kind of leads on to the next question, which I know is taking up a lot of questions in the media and around the industries. How long the property transaction is currently taking? And I know it could be how long is a piece of string, but let's look at it from what we've just discussed.
Yeah, and I think the challenge in Ireland is it's not as cut and dried as ordering something online or bringing a car in for a service. And there's a few things at play. That could be individuals' timelines, backstories to properties, and also how prepared multiple parties are involved. So, to give you an example, as a general rule, it could take anywhere from 6 to 8 weeks for a property to complete. But if I was to give you an example of a timeline, and let's say, for example, a buyer today makes a bid, and let's say it's a really simple transaction where the first bid is accepted. Let's just imagine that there isn't the kind of busy market we have at the moment and a lot of active buyers. Your offer is accepted. You're then invited to have a survey done, and that can take between a couple of days and a couple of weeks to get your chosen surveyor. And it's important to get someone that you trust, but is also adept to understanding what it is you need to know about the property. Because one person who has bought multiple times may not have the same concerns as a first-time buyer who doesn't understand the what's involved in buying a period property or into an apartment building.
Or do they have enough money to buy in a specific area based on their mortgage?
Yeah, but equally from the surveying point of view, it would be a case of do they have the wherewithal to understand what they're buying. It's never as simple as buying a property today and you never have any outlay. It's much like a car, except on a bigger scale. If you buy a new development, you don't have to expect that you're going to have upgrading costs in the short term. If you buy an older property because you like something with character, a surveyor could guide you on potential remedial work you may not have thought of. And most of the time, you want to have preemptive questions so a surveyor can understand where you're coming from. And there's no such thing as a stupid question, because a surveyor is there to guide you from start to finish. And no house, much like anything, is perfect. But once you understand and accept what's involved the day you buy it, or potentially in the future, such as a roof to be changed, or if you want to do an extension or limitations on a building, you can then make an informed decision. But it's important to do something like that before you actually buy the property, because the old adage, the day you buy is the day you sell. And you have to be aware of what you're getting yourself in for. If it's an apartment block, you're dealing with multiple other partners that are aligned with you as part of a management company and general upkeep. If you're buying an older property, there will be upkeep costs, and you have to be made aware of that by someone who knows the industry inside out.
Is there any other factors you do believe at play in the current, or can be improved from your day to day on the ground?
I think underlying absolutely everything is probably communication. I think when you take, for example, two simple parties, that if one person is doing one thing with another, so if I'm buying a car from you today, I give you the money, you give me the car, and we make a transfer. I think a lot of the times nowadays, there's a lot of mixed messaging when it comes to different parties or different stakeholders involved in the process. So you may have a very proactive estate agent, a very proactive legal team, and there may be someone in the mortgage side that isn't as slow, or there may be moving parts that you're not aware of. I find that when it comes to buying and selling, communication of information between both sides is absolutely huge, and it's often overlooked until something goes wrong.
You know I'm going to do it. I'm going to throw a corker at you. Do you believe that transaction or that process can be streamlined through technology while keeping the agent front and foremost of being in the transaction, being in that whole process of start to finish, and be in control? Because let's be honest, it is the elephant in the room that we're seeing in other countries, that's happening in Europe, that's happening in the States, and people are fearful of it. And I do believe that the agent can be within that process, within the whole transaction from start to finish, because they're needed from a regulation standpoint. They're needed within the process, and they just think it's breaking down the barrier of fear of getting engaged in technology. If you're not in control of the tech you use, it will control you. So do you think from an agent's perspective that we can get within the process and that we can streamline the transaction?
Technology is neither good nor bad. It is. It just is, much like any circumstance. And that's not to say, you look at the ground and say there's no weeds, there's no weeds. Technology has a part to play in everything we do. Anyone who has an iPhone or a smartphone has, kind of succumbed to that over the last decade. I think what we have to look at from a process point of view is the systemic issues that surround why we buy property in Ireland from the basic standpoint of our relationship with property. And as Irish people, we're probably very unique in how we view property ownership. We also don't have the structure in place to be able to make it as streamlined. And that, again, is part of the systemic. Over the last number of decades, you have different types of ways of communicating. You have different relationships people have, and no one sector has wanted to come together to create a simplified system where everyone does what they need to do. They all work in tandem, and they all work along a simplified system that is more transparent. I think probably the biggest challenge is trying to get the various services or the various experts to come to the table and understand that this isn't to be feared, that this is going to be inevitable. If we don't tackle it at some point in the future, there will be another American company who comes in with another version of how we convey property, and they will just slot it in, and it then becomes a plug and play that may not fit our model. And I think it's important for us to explore, at the very least, what it is we can do to assess how our market's different to others, and then look at not necessarily throwing mud against a wall and seeing what sticks, but addressing what elements of the process we can maybe test
or mitigate
learn from, and repeat.
I think you hit the nail on the head there, and I think the big piece of the puzzle is education.
Hugely so. It's not to be feared. I think it's much like me as an agent. I don't see other agents as my competition. I see myself as my own competition because I have my own goals. If we all utilize technology to our advantage, and you'll see the advent of valuation tools, bidding platforms, virtual tours, the amount of people that probably wouldn't have wanted to use a virtual tour for the next decade if COVID didn't force them, showed how adaptable we can be as agents, as people, and also as buyers and sellers.
Mm-hmm. So where, what makes it worth it, just to really nail off the topic, of today's episode? Is it worth buying in the current climate? If I'm being chased in the market in one direction, yes, I need a house over my head, but the traditional mindset of I must have, a property in a specific area, is it worth having a home?
I think it's not, and it's not because I'm an agent that I say that. I'd be very genuine if I felt it wasn't. I think what's at play here is the history of how we own property in Ireland, as I mentioned. We all have a different way of viewing how we live, and also our rental structure isn't actually designed alongside a lot of other European countries, in terms of you could have a person who lives in Germany, they enjoy their entire life there, and then they transfer it over to their children and they can enjoy it as they have. In Ireland, it tends to be fragmented, and the standard of living expectations are not in line with other cities. So someone buying a property 25 years ago has different expectations now. And much like I look at what I own and what my daughter could own in 20 to 30 years' time, I can't imagine my daughter having parking space at her property. And that's if she has a house. It may be some other hybrid version of a unit, or
that's if she has a car.
Exactly.
And
I think when I look at it, I suppose one point to note is that a lot of people coming from abroad, that they normally build a career abroad, but equally look to return to Ireland. And it's not always the house that actually plays a role in what they want. It's actually free education, it's their family, it's lifestyle. So I encounter a lot of people as a buy-side agent where they come from abroad having built a career and made a certain amount of money that may not be here for the last decade. But when all's said and done, they want to come back to Ireland to settle. And that's usually something that's not necessarily a monetary figure. It's actually something money can't buy in their eyes, which is plugging back into the community that they enjoyed. But I think there is a lot to be said for the future of how we view living in Ireland, and even the simple example of the Capital Dock idea in Dublin city centre, in terms of the amenities, the way it's designed, and the thought process that went into creating a living space that you don't have to leave, in terms of common areas, pool rooms, cinema rooms.
Ecosystems within spaces, yeah.
There's a huge element to that. It doesn't always have to be, I need a 4-bedroom house with a front and back garden, and it needs to be an X location.
If we look across the street, you see things like, if you're looking down the Liffey, you see new developments from some of the bigger developers, top 3, 4 developers. How do we deal with the commercial space being, 1, unoccupied, and 2, sustainability problems? You see their lights on at night. They're trying to, make life, make areas look like they're full of life. I don't believe they are, because the lights are on and no one's in the buildings. How do we look at transitioning the commercial units and space in Ireland into residential homes to deal with some of the massive problems that we have?
I think it's going to take a lot more than an inter-community level of thinking. I think when you have to look at new development costs as a whole at the moment. and they're being pushed every day. We know, we've all heard about material costs, we know about planning issues, we know about judicial reviews, and the delay for residential developers is so huge. And it's quite at odds with what the public understand to be building. And I think where we could potentially look at is faster turnaround times in terms of how planning is reviewed, and also how people are informed about what a development means. And then the knock-on effect, I think, could be look at the residential side in parallel with the commercial element, acknowledge the changes that are happening with hybrid, with remote working, and figure out a way to assess and potentially test certain areas in terms of if you transferred a commercial area in a prime location into some form of hybrid residential commercial office space, test it, give it a timeline to get the data and see if it works. That could be something to look at. But I think the reality in Ireland is there are people who were building 20, 30, 40 years ago, and you're looking at how build costs and objections have implicated or implemented, changed how they build now, that a builder who would build 20, 30 years ago has had to completely change their model. And the general public probably don't understand what's involved. And that's not to be condescending. It's more that, you buy land, and what you could have built 50 houses on 25 years ago, you're now building 500 apartments because you have to. And I think it's probably a very similar thing, going back to your question about the commercial element. I think it comes back to how we all view property: ownership, rental, long leases, lifestyle. And also it's about educating people into understanding the benefits and the drawbacks of both, because there's a price to be paid for everything. If you buy a big period house, it is full of character, it's full of style, but there's a price to be paid for keeping it. If you buy a new build, you're going to pay more, but it's up to a more modern standard in terms of technology. And lifestyle will play a role in how we live in the future. But I think there's a lot to be said for, as times change and as we get a grasp on how we all return to the office or don't, or a mixture of both, time will tell as to the role it's going to play, but it's probably too early to tell.
Very good. Guys, I think we're going to wrap that up. We spent two and a half minutes over than we should. Andrew, we've got a special announcement. We're going to have hopefully Shane Fleming, who we've been trying to plug for the last couple of weeks, but he seems to be busy.
Absolutely,
with his business,
traveling the globe. I think he's taking over the US one state at a time. So we'd love to see him on this podcast soon.
So I think it's called the real estate. Is that what he's calling his, or simply real estate? Shane, hope to see you now next week, guys. I'll leave Andrew's details below in the link, and hope to see you again next week.